Thanks very much. Cool. Well, thanks, everyone. Thanks to my fellow participants, to everyone attending, to Gray Area for hosting, and to Thorsten, of course, for putting this amazing event together, and for the invitation to participate. My talk is The Woodshed is a Black Box. That's what it's about. We're here to talk about algorithms and culture, and in a variety of disciplines and from a variety of perspectives. The algorithmic culture I'm going to focus on is one that occurs within music communities. I want to talk about the algorithms that we call music communities. The petri dish in which this activity takes place is often called, in musician vernacular, the woodshed. Now, the woodshed is it's sort of the classic place to which a musician retreats. It's where they go in order to practice, to work things through, and to self-improve. It's often thought of as a solitary venture. It's self-funded, low budget, sort of like a one-off artist retreat of one. I will also show that the solitary aspect of this isn't actually necessary, and it isn't even optimal. Now, woodshed is the sort of word that doesn't really require detailed etymological dissection when being introduced as a topic. You just put the word wood and the word shed together and you kind of get the picture. But one thing that should be noted is that woodshed is more often, in this context, not a noun but a verb. One may certainly go to a woodshed as a musician, but more likely one will woodshed. The word woodshed has particular presence in jazz, and it appears frequently in the biographies and autobiographies of jazz musicians. The bit that's up here now is from Louis Armstrong, An Extravagant Life, a 1997 book by Lawrence Bergreen on the early jazz trumpeter. The Lil you'll see quoted here, the she is this woman named Lil. The Lil there, providing the anecdote, is Lil Hardin Armstrong. That was Satchmo's second wife, of 4, if you're keeping track. She was, as I understand it, she was the one who was really his equal as a musician. I like that even from the vantage of the 1920s, the word woodshed was already a throwback to a still earlier time. She talks about how we would practice together, we'd woodshed, as we say, from the old-time way of going out into the woodshed to practice a new song. What's great here is that she talks about the technical and compositional complexities they were wrestling with. We used to play classical music together sometimes. We brought classical trumpet music. The biography is rich with these details about the self-isolation required to make progress, but how often this isolation was in pairs or smaller groups. This probably goes without saying, but one other thing to note is that woodshedding only really is woodshedding if it takes a toll, which is recognized just in this same brief space. So the woodshed I'd like to invite you into is one called the Disquiet Junto. It's a music community that's been running for, well, it's its 8th year right now. Specifically, it's now in its 377th consecutive week, as of yesterday, March 21st, 2019. Now, I know the weekly count is up to 377 because, not because I'm a bit of a train spotter, but because specifically weekly projects are the organizing principle of the Disquiet Junto community. The way the Junto works is as follows. Each Thursday, you can see the story of the project there. Each Thursday, a compositional prompt is sent out to the music community, currently about 1,300 subscribers to the email announcement list. And then they have until the following Monday to respond with a piece of music that takes that prompt as its goal. I'll talk more about the Junto shortly, but since we're gathered in San Francisco to engage with algorithms and culture, how about we start things off by making some culture? What follows right now, immediately, is the current Disquiet Junto project, done in coordination with this assembly. There will be a sequence of instructions that follows, an algorithm, as it were, 6 steps with some extra credit. Every Junto project comes as a series of steps. This week's project was provided by a Junto community member named Charlie Kramer. He records as Northwoods, and he works mostly in the language Chuck. That's with a capital K. Not every Junto musician works directly in programming, far from it. But Kramer is one. Another is a woman named Erica Ness, who's based in Boston, who does phenomenal work with fractals. But let's get on with Charlie Kramer's prompt. So, step 1, define a scale of 8 notes. You don't need to do this on your laptops now. I'll post this later on. Step 2 is create a melody with 4 notes from the scale resulting from step 1. The third is to replace the second note in the melodic sequence from step 2 with an unused note, selected deterministically or randomly. This third step is a little long. It could probably be multiple steps, but we're going to just put the last bit here. Then do this for note 4, then 3, then for note 1. Reintroduce the first melody as counterpoint. This establishes a pair of notes, and then repeat the algorithm on these pairs, and then repeat again to create triplets. Sequence variations to create a piece of music, and he provided some extra credit as well. Do the same with note durations and velocities. So the details for this, and I'll have the URL at the end as well, for this current project is disquiet.com/0377. The deadline is Monday at 11:59 p.m., wherever you are. And that's how every project works. It goes out Thursday via the email list into all these various places that I'll talk about in a little while, and then you have till Monday to get it done. Now, I want to talk today about the way that this music community functions. I want to talk about how the Junto is created as a result of rules, how the Junto employs rules, and how it engenders rules, which is to say I want to talk about how rules formed it, shaped it, and fuel it. Now, since rules are expressed in language, let's start with language. I think it would help to explain that the name Disquiet Junto comes from specific places, and since we're talking about how language leads to things, language, like rules, has consequences, sometimes, as we know, unforeseen ones. So the Disquiet is from the name of a website I founded in 1996. It's called disquiet.com, and it continues to run to this day. I'm not a great self-archiver, so I had to go to the Wayback Machine to find, on the Internet Archive, to find this early screenshot. As you'll see in a minute, if you're not familiar, which most of you probably are not, it looks almost exactly the same 20-plus years later. I did start adding images. I was very straight-edged about it being text-only until about 2007, and then I added images in, 11 years after launching it. So the image of this early homepage, one funny thing, by the way, about living in San Francisco is how local the Internet is. The apartment that I lived in the Richmond district from 1996 to 1999 is a block and a half from where the Internet Archive now calls home. For all intents and purposes, disquiet.com is a blog, but I started writing it regularly before the word blog actually surfaced, so I feel like I can claim some allegiance to a nebulous territory, and perhaps the Junto's existence reinforces that potential variety. So why did I do this? When I purchased the URL disquiet.com in 1996, an action I will add for the younger people in the crowd required a fax machine and a phone call and quite a bit of time sitting around waiting. I had just left working at Tower Records after 7 years there as a full-time editor. That, by the way, is not how long I was there. That's how long Tower Records was here. I was a full-time editor on its print music magazines. These included Pulse, which existed before I got there. The covers that you see here are now the wallpaper, because the company no longer exists, nor does the magazine, but it's lovely wallpaper on Solomon's Delicatessen in Davis, California, named for Russ Solomon, who founded Tower Records. There are also two magazines I helped found there. There was Classical Pulse, which, as the name suggests, was about classical music, and there was E-Pulse, which, as the E suggests, it was very de rigueur in the time, suggests was an online publication. So Tower's first online publication, it published from 1994 to 2004 as an email publication. And 2004 to 2006 is when Tower really shut down, except for peculiar vestiges, such as the thriving stores that exist to this day in Tokyo. This is one from Akihabara, and there's also one in Shibuya. Just in case there's any Tower truthers out there, this place does still exist. That arrow there is to the Japanese translation of my book about Aphex Twin's Selected Ambient Works Volume 2, which just came out last month. And there's some Japanese to prove where it was taken. A friend just shot this this week. So I founded the website disquiet.com because shortly after leaving Tower to take a new job at what we then called a .com, but was later after the crash called a startup. I guess they had to rebrand to clean up the term. I realized how much my own identity was tied up with being a full-time music editor. It wasn't something I considered when I accepted this new job. I just didn't know who I was anymore. And I realized that having a place where I could publish regularly would provide me an identity I felt lacking. I cast about for names for this identity and settled on a short list and eventually went with disquiet.com. I personally, in my writing, focus on ambient music and sound, and more broadly what I've come to think of as the intersection of sound, art, and technology. The tagline for the site is listening to art, playing with audio, composing, sounding out technology, and composing in code. The prominence of code as a form of composition has increased significantly over the course of the website's 20-plus years of operation. I don't recommend aging if you have the option. It's not so good on the knees, but it does give you some perspective as time goes on. The word disquiet, so where did it come from? I borrowed it from a beloved book by Fernando Pessoa, the late Portuguese futurist poet. It's titled The Book of Disquiet. Pessoa died in 1935, and this book was published posthumously. Technically, though, Pessoa isn't the attributed author of the Book of Disquiet. The Book of Disquiet is credited to Bernardo Soares. Soares is Pessoa, in that it's a name Pessoa used sometimes when writing. Now, Bernardo Soares is one of dozens of names, dozens of identities that Pessoa created and used. Let's not say that, let's say whom. It's dozens of identities whom Pessoa created and used. Others included Alberto Cairo, Alvaro de Campos, Ricardo Reis. There are dozens of these. But Pessoa came up with so many names that he became synonymous, not just with all those invented people, but with the whole concept of having multiple presences. So the word he's most synonymous with is the word for that concept, which is heteronym. You know, I didn't actually think much at the time in 1996 that while casting about for an identity for myself, I had instinctively grabbed as a lifeline a word employed by someone famously conflicted about having a specific identity. That honestly didn't occur to me until many, many years later. Or that I had grasped the word that, or I hadn't actually grasped the word that firmly since I was using a translation of the word Pessoa himself used. The actual title of the book is this, which I will not do any damage to the Portuguese language by pronouncing. I will just say that it is too long, at the time at least, seemed to be a URL. So I went with Disquiet. I will say that someone at some point did actually buy that URL, and it's available for $2,000 if you've got it. I am not the seller, I assure you. To sum up, Pessoa's Disquiet, engaging with it, it instilled the Disquiet.com activities with several key things that have had consequences ever since. The core to it are this idea of identity, this concept of publishing, and finally this concept of writing, or more generally this idea of music criticism. So where did Junto come from? The other half of the name of the Disquiet Junto music community is about 200 years older. It comes from this fellow, Benjamin Franklin. I borrowed the Junto from one of the founding parental units of the United States of America, Benjamin Franklin. This was in 2012 that I did this. That's when the Junto was founded. I had just finished reading Walter Isaacson's biography of Benjamin Franklin. I was a bit anxious about the one about Steve Jobs for various reasons, and I thought, well, I'll read this to sort of ground me. I actually never got around to the other one. I was really struck by the name of the Junto and the concept of this Junto club that Franklin had formed in 1727. That's where the name comes from. He was somewhat recently in Philadelphia, and he had formed this club. I personally believe he founded it as a way to access other people's books, but it had other more generous purposes. I had actually read Franklin's autobiography in college and then utterly forgotten about the Junto until I read Isaacson's book. As I understand it, Franklin, who while being brilliant, had a bit of a sort of self-consciously macho thing going on, he took the word junta and chose to make a masculine version of it. In any case, what appealed to me wasn't this sort of hegemonic sexism of colonial America, but the purpose of Franklin's junto, which he described in his autobiography as a club of mutual improvement. I just love this idea. I was really intrigued by this tension between, because I read improvement as self-improvement, so I read it as mutual self-improvement, which is, I don't know, it struck me as a beautiful concept, and I really realized that this idea that was becoming the Junto could take on that. I also considered the fact that this club formed based on rules, again, to get back to the theme of today's and tomorrow's conference, that played a role in all this, and the idea that all the participants created original work, in this phrase, his own writing, and then shared it with their fellow members, presumably for discussion. Now, Benjamin Franklin was something of a serial inventor of clubs. He helped form an early fire department a decade after the Junto. Years later, he did the same with what became the University of Pennsylvania, and I would argue in many ways, as others have, that the Junto was a trial run, his Junto was a trial run for the biggest club that Franklin helped form, which is the United States, whose rules are founded in the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. From little things, big things grow. So to sum up here, if Pessoa's Disquiet had this idea of identity and publishing and writing, Franklin's Junto contributed these other ideas of mutual self-improvement, communal rules, and this creation, in our case, of music. Now, there may be one or two Franklin scholars or admirers in the audience, and you're probably like moving like this in your seat saying, yes, yes, the Constitution is a really nifty document, but what about the glass harmonica? It is true that Benjamin Franklin, among his like 6,000 other inventions and improvements to existing technology, which is probably what most inventions actually are, developed his own glass harmonica, a version of which is depicted here. This is a modern one. Early on in the Disquiet Junto, we did a project based on the glass harmonica. It was one among many as the structure of the community came slowly into form. So all Junto projects come in the form of steps. Every Junto project starts with a number of steps. Some are as few as one, there's often upwards of 10. The very first Junto, which was launched just a few blocks from here at a cafe that no longer exists up on Valencia, I was just sitting there fiddling away. The very first project was a one-line instruction, this one here, record the sound of ice in a glass and make something of it. When I did that, I had no idea if anyone was going to respond. In fact, when I tell the story as I do on occasion, I feel the exact same anxiety I did that day. Because up until that point, I'd only written about music that existed. If a record came out and I enjoyed it, or I went to a concert, or I went to a sound art exhibit, and it was interesting, I wrote about it. This would be music that I was writing about, and if no one did it, it didn't exist. I still feel the force of that. It worked, fortunately. About 60 or so musicians joined in, and it's rolled weekly ever since. Oh, by the way, I started labeling them OOO like that because I'm a fan of the Long Now Foundation, so that was like put a little bit on the horizon. Now, there were projects that preceded this. There were proto-Junto projects. So I'm not sure if anyone is aware of this one, but in 2007, it was the anniversary of one of my favorite records of all time, which is My Life in the Bush of Ghosts by David Byrne and Brian Eno. And it's not that long ago, but in 2007, it was somewhat unusual that musicians would put up stems or little segments of their records to be remixed, especially commercial records that were perceived by record companies to have this thing called financial value, which we all know now is sort of silly. They put up this music online and let people remix it, and I was fascinated that they were letting people do this, in part because as a fan of that record, I just wanted to listen to those little segments. The problem was that I couldn't stand any of the music people were putting up. I was kind of recoiling from it. And if nothing else, it wasn't true to the spirit of the original album or even exploring it in any way. So I sent the music to all these other musicians and said, man, could you do something with this? Because this music's great, and you should make something of it yourself. And everyone replied saying yes, and I will not post it on that website because you're right, all that other music is something I don't want to be next to. So I had to self-publish it on the Internet Archive, ironically, it just occurred to me. And we posted it, and it was a great way to engage with musicians. Because up until this point, I'd only been a music critic. I'd written about music. And I discovered that over time, I felt that once in a while, when I interviewed a musician, it stopped being a Q&A and started being a conversation. And conversations were a way to pursue ideas. And this was in 2007, and it was a real moment for me personally and professionally. It was a moment where I sort of passed over this threshold of anxiety about communicating with musicians and realized we didn't just have to talk about ideas, we could pursue them and see them through. And suddenly that idea went from being a kind of hypothetical to being something that a compilation project such as this would provide an engine to see it through. The steps detailing any given project were sort of the algorithm that created it, that engendered it. We did a bunch of these. The last one was called Instagrambient. This was in 2011. So Instagrambient was interesting for me because, for various reasons I won't go into now because it's not totally pertinent to the conversation for this weekend. But the gist of it was that I'd come to realize that the concerts I went to, almost everyone in the audience except me was a musician. I would go, and often it was the other musicians attending. Those of you who go to the luggage store, it's a classic example. But it was often maybe a few other musicians who just wanted to show up. And I felt that was sort of, to many people, considered a bad joke. Like, your music's so experimental, the only people in the audience are other musicians. And I was like, well, what if that's a good thing? And so Instagramming was an attempt to take what I thought was the energy that made our previous projects work and focus it inward. So what I did was I sent a note out to a bunch of musicians and said, oh, and by note, I mean I tweeted. And I said, why don't you all send me an Instagram photo you're proud of, and I'm going to redistribute them among other musicians, and here's the deal. This is now the cover to your next single. Go record the single. So we had this situation where there were 25 covers and 25 musicians, and everyone got a different one, and that release became Instagrambient. Thanks to the designer who worked on most of these things is named Brian Scott. He does gorgeous work. So that was a big step from what I'd done before, because up until that point, I'd really carefully selected the musicians I wanted to be on these compilations. And it worked so well, I thought, well, what if we opened it wide, which is what led to the Junto. So I wanted to push the idea of musicians making music for each other even further. So I just opened it up to whoever wanted to participate, which is where that first Junto project came from. Just open it up and see who joins in. The Junto was originally formed to take advantage of SoundCloud, a functionality on it specifically called groups. That functionality eventually went away, leading to something of a Junto diaspora. We still function mostly on SoundCloud, but the Junto has survived the very code that had engendered it. It is now pursuing a post-platform reality. These days, it takes place on a community called Lines, on my own site via this announcement list on TinyLetter, as I mentioned. And the music continues to largely be on SoundCloud, but also on YouTube, Clip, Vimeo, and Bandcamp. And I will say that the way that we're exploring how code kind of structures culture, I'm fascinated by how the unintended consequences of the SoundCloud groups had benefits to it that I don't think anyone who worked on the product was necessarily aware of. And I can say this in part because I know some of those people because SoundCloud was incredibly supportive of the Junto when it first started out, which is the only reason I have 10,000 followers. It has nothing to do with anything other than the fact that they stuck this on the homepage for a very long time. So to be really clear, the Junto is nothing new. There are other music communities that preceded it and succeeded it. There's the Iron Chef of Music is a good example. That was an early one. Stone Throw's Beat Battles is particularly good. Subsequent to the Junto, there's been the Weekly Beats, which is every 2 years, and then there's the Naviar Haiku. Naviar Haiku is like one Junto project every week. What it is that rather than having a different project every week, they send out a haiku, and you respond to that haiku in sound. It's quite beautiful. I've contributed some haikus to it as well. It's very nice. Weekly Beats is just about producing music. It's like the opposite of the Junto. There's no restraint whatsoever. You just do what you choose to do. There's some suggestions occasionally, but it's just the idea you walk into that woodshed and you see what comes out. Stone's Throw Beat Battles is the most self-sustaining of any of them, because the way Stone's Throw Beat Battles work, it's a hip-hop based one, is that a sample is proposed, everyone, or is posited, everyone who participates produces a track for it. They upload it to a place. That place it hasn't quite had the diaspora as it's just sort of been a nomad tribe. They've been on lots of different services. They were for a long time on Drop.io, and then someone, I think Facebook bought it, but they just used the technology, so it went away, and they've kind of gone from place to place. They were on SoundCloud for a while, but now they're somewhere else, I believe. But in any case, Stone's Throw Beat Battles, the way it works is that whoever is voted as the winner then chooses the sample for the next week. So no one has to moderate it or anything. It's a genius operation. Of course, there were movements long before this that predicted this sort of activity, and I always look to Oulipo, Fluxus, and deep listening as sources of this. Pictured here is Pauline Oliveros, the deep listening thinker. So for all the rule-based natures of the projects, I had very few conscious rules when I started out, but over time, rules became clear in retrospect. The first one is that these projects are doable without prior or intended subsequent involvement in the Disquiet Junto. You don't have to have any knowledge. Each project needs to be, we talk about algorithms as being sort of like, we can be a little too rigorous about how they can be infallible, but I would say that one of the ideas they can be easily interpreted, and so no cultural knowledge about the community should be necessary to participate. I want it to be very welcoming. There should be a very low threshold of familiarity to being able to join in. The projects are doable in one session. Even if it might be a long session, you can do it in one sitting. And then the projects are doable offline. You can do it anywhere, which I recommend. And then lastly, there are no winners. Nothing against the Stone's Throw Beat Battles. I think it makes especially good sense in a hip-hop sort of milieu that the competition will be part of it, but it's sort of everyone's a winner in the Junto. It's gold stars for all. It's really, the winner is simply just getting the project done, and another aspect of the Junto, the rules go on and on. It's a bit like, well, in any case, the rules go on and on. Another one would be that, that you're not supposed to submit anything you considered finished. The idea is the true work in the woodshed is that it's just about achieving something and pushing yourself. So this idea of being out of your comfort zone is essential to it. Those are the rules that I just shared for the Junto, the bylaws of the network of woodsheds into which various musicians in the Junto enter. The woodshed is this black box, a friendly crucible in which we're transformed, not just individually, but collectively. I'd been pondering the network of woodsheds that is the Junto before I read the Louis Armstrong biography. Even though I was fully comfortable with the concept of non-isolated self-improvement as a musician, I was very happy to learn that the concept of woodshed as a solitary pursuit was in fact overstated, and there's historical evidence that it could be a mutual activity. Not overstated, however, is how true woodshedding means getting out of what some will call their comfort zone. This quote here from Richard Fair is from an article by the music journalist Lottie Brazier, who wrote an article about the Junto a few years ago for the British magazine The Wire, quoting a Junto participant. Now, the benefit of a network creative space is when musicians want to collaborate, they can. Some Junto projects build on previous ones. They're still structured in a way that you can join at any stage, but we'll have 3-4 multi-week projects where a piece of music that originates the first week is then processed each week by a different person, or the individual themselves has the choice to build on it. Some Junto projects build on previous ones. You can still join at any time, but the most important thing, I think, is that you can experience your own music in new ways. The person whose name is in the center there, Ethan Hine, he's a really fascinating guy. He's getting his PhD, actually just got his PhD at NYU. It's like he's on the verge of like ABD, he's writing it, I follow his progress. But in any case, he's a wonderful guy, and he has a chapter about the Junto coming out in the Oxford Guide to Music Education and Social Media, I believe, this year or next. But in any case, this is a chart that he made for a 3-part project. The way this worked is that every participant contributed a track, which we positioned to the left side of the monitor. Then, so that's what the blue ones are. Then the red ones are the second week, someone added another track to the right side and gave it a new title. And then the third week, someone added a track in the center and gave it a third title. And so what you're seeing here is Ethan produced that first chair at the wavetable. Then the second week, he contributed to Modus Pony's left chair, which led to Plucks and Drums. So you can track it through there, and then the names at the bottom are the ones who finished off those tracks. And he talks about the beauty of experiencing his own music through different years. Ethan also said my favorite thing about the Junto that I've ever heard anyone say, which is that he hears me. It's not Lil Hardin Armstrong. He writes reviews of music that don't exist yet and then gets the internet strangers to make it, which I just love. The idea is that this gets to the heart of how projects are reverse engineered from ideas. A concept is investigated. This is where Junto projects come from. We take an idea, we break it down into steps, and then we share the steps with the community to see what they make of it. So that's the Disquiet Junto. This talk is as much an investigation of the algorithmic, in the adjectival sense, aspects of music communities, but also an invitation to participate. Many Junto projects, such as the one we're doing this very weekend, are initiated by members of the community. Sometimes as well, they come from people outside the community. We've had writers and artists and other musicians propose ideas to the Junto in the form of multi-step projects. I'm not going to read through these names, but these are just special thanks to some folks who have helped me think this through. As a music critic, I spend a lot of time thinking about other people's work. As the moderator for this now 8-year-old community, I actually spend not a lot of time pondering it, just doing it. But talks like this are a great opportunity to reflect, but it helps to have a couple of helpful hands. I also wanted to include the photo credits just to be on the up and up. And that's it, thank you. That covers it. The URLs are here for the specific project and for the Junto if you want to join in. And I really appreciate the time to share the work that everyone does. Take care. This is where if there might be a question, but it's totally fine if there are not. Thanks. There is no preference, and just to build on that, in fact, one thing I've discovered over the years that's so fun is that several people have told me that the Junto is the most experimental music they've ever made, and for others they've told me it's the most pop thing they've ever done. There is, I will say, just because I've written about ambient music for so long, I think some people when they first enter think, oh, I got to make some ambient music. Over time it becomes clear that's not the case. And I frequently do projects to push it, to remind people to do other things. Several projects in, I purposely did one that had to be recorded live because I didn't want anyone to think this was just a sample of the week kind of thing, which it often is.